blocked at the M23 for recovery work. Long queues back to Leatherhead and back onto the M23. And heading out of England into Wales, long delays on the M4 from Bristol. The Prince of Wales Bridge is closed following a serious accident and spillage, and delays of an hour on trains out of Exeter, St David's to Newton Abbot and Devon following an earlier landslip. That's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
There's still time to win our Summer Spectacular with an incredible trio of treats, and you could win them. First, there's a fabulous £15,000 in tax-free cash to ensure this summer is special. What would you spend that on? Next, you'll also receive the latest iPhone 15 and a set of Apple AirPods. And finally, £500 to spend at your favourite UK attraction. For another chance to win the iPhone, treats and £15,000 cash, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can also enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2 or post your name and number to GB06 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 28th of June. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, it's 7 p.m. on Friday, the 21st of June, and this is a GB News election special with me, Patrick Christys. Welcome to Vote 2024, The Leaders. Yes, welcome to a special edition of Vote 2024, The Leaders. I am Patrick Christys, and tonight I'll be bringing you a special sit-down with the man hoping to be Prime Minister in 2 weeks' time. Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party. Sir Keir will be answering the questions that you have sent in. So, please keep them coming, because this is the first of some interviews to come with other party leaders as well. Tonight will be a show about all of the leaders. We have representatives from each of the 3 major parties exactly 2 weeks before one of them takes hold of the keys to Downing Street. What has Rishi Sunak really got in store for the younger generation, for example?
You'll have a set of sanctions and incentives, and we will look at the models that are existing around Europe to get the appropriate mix of those. There's a range of different options that exist.
For example?
Yeah, I mean, is it right that people who don't do national service get the driving licence taken off? I suspect many of you think it is right, actually, so get in touch on that. And is Sir Keir Starmer still in no man's land when it comes to his previous support for Jeremy Corbyn?
When you said Jeremy Corbyn would make a good Prime Minister, did you mean it?
Look, he would be a better Prime Minister. Well, look what we got, Boris Johnson.
Well, yeah, but quite a lot happened under that Boris Johnson tenure, didn't it? And would Jeremy Corbyn have really dealt with any of that better? It'll be a good talking point. Plus, can Sir Ed Davey ever shirk the legacy of the coalition of, well, Lib Dem chaos, anyway?
Britain desperately needs a leader who we can respect and trust. Your media profile has mainly consisted of horseplay on TV. Is this prime ministerial?
Well, reacting to all of this, I'm very pleased to say I've got the former Conservative Minister, Diana Davison. I've also got former Head of Media for the Liberal Democrat, Sean Kemp, and the Labour Councillor, Brendan Chilton. We've got a cracking show tonight. It's all go. Sir Keir Starmer will be answering your questions in about half an hour's time. But first, it's the news.
Good evening, I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB Newsroom. Your top story this hour. Opposition leaders are accusing the Tories of being corrupt after a string of people with links to the party are caught up in allegations of betting on the timing of the general election. 4 people are being investigated by the Gambling Commission, including Laura Saunders, the wife of the Tories' campaign director. Craig Williams, another Conservative candidate, has also admitted to an error of judgment after placing a bet on when the election would take place. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says any lawbreakers will be booted out of the party, but Lib Dem leader Sir Ed Davey says the Conservatives aren't learning from their mistakes.
People know the outcome of something and they bet on it. I think that's immoral, and I don't think that looks right. And too often in this Parliament we've seen the Conservative Party, certainly members of the Conservative Party, looking like they're in it for themselves, not for public service and what's in the best interest of the country.
Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak's attempting to move on from the scandal, accusing Labour of planning to change every rule they can to stay in power if they win the general election. The Prime Minister's urging the voters not to sleepwalk into the polls on the 4th of July. Speaking at the launch of the Conservatives' manifesto for Wales, he warned against falling into Labour's trap. Sir Keir Starmer says Jeremy Corbyn would have made a better Prime Minister than Boris Johnson. He was facing a grilling from members of the public alongside Rishi Sunak, Sir Ed Davey and John Swinney at last night's BBC Question Time Leaders Special in York. The Labour leader says he's now changed the party and claims it's clear to see the chaos that happens under a Conservative government.
The choice at the last election before the electorate was not a good choice. You had Boris Johnson, who won and then 3 years later was thrown out of Parliament for breaking the rules. You had Jeremy Corbyn, who is now expelled from the Labour Party. That's why I have been so determined to change the Labour Party and to make sure that that changed Labour Party puts forward a credible manifesto for growth, so that at this election there will be a real choice between carrying on with the failure of the last 14 years or turning the page and rebuilding the country.
And in Wales, workers at Tata Steel have announced an indefinite strike from the 8th of July in protest over the company's plans to close blast furnaces and cut 2,800 jobs. Unite, who represent more than 1,500 members in South Wales, says this is the first UK steelworker strike in over 40 years. Tata is transitioning to greener steel production, but workers argue it sacrifices their jobs and community. And for the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
OK, so welcome back. Now, since becoming Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer has struggled with his stance on Jeremy Corbyn. Initially, he praised Corbyn as a potential great Prime Minister and served in the shadow cabinet. However, he later expelled Corbyn from the party, only to then say that Corbyn would have been a better Prime Minister than Boris Johnson during a BBC Question Time special last night. Let's take a little look a bit later on at that clip. But here with me to discuss all of this is the former Conservative Minister, Deanna Davison. I've also got former Head of Media for the Liberal Democrats, Sean Kemp, and the Labour Councillor, Brendan Chilton. Well, Brendan, I will have to start with you on this. Would Jeremy Corbyn have made a better Prime Minister than Boris Johnson?
I always think a Labour Prime Minister is better than a Conservative one, but at the last general election, the country was served a very poor choice. We had in Jeremy Corbyn a man that was totally unfit to be Prime Minister. We could see that before we went into the election. And then we had Boris Johnson, who, when he became Prime Minister, it emerged, was also totally unfit to be Prime Minister. That election has now passed. We've got a real strong choice between us now, and I think Keir Starmer's doing an excellent job leading the Labour Party.
Yeah, no, arguably... In fact, I'll tell you what, let's play the clip and then we'll talk a bit more off the back of it, right? So let's have it.
To answer this yes or no, when you said Jeremy Corbyn would make a good Prime Minister, did you mean it?
Look, he would be a better Prime Minister. Well, look what we got, Boris Johnson. A man who made massive promises, didn't keep them, and then had to leave Parliament in disgrace.
Deanna, we've had Gaza, I think that could have been quite bad for Jeremy Corbyn. The Russia invasion of Ukraine as well. There was the COVID pandemic. I'm absolutely not saying that Boris Johnson dealt magnificently with that, but that did happen. And the final throes of Brexit. I mean, is Keir Starmer right to even suggest that Jeremy Corbyn would have dealt with any of that better, do you think?
I mean, I think anyone sitting in number 10 with some of the horrific events that we've had to endure over the last 5 years would have had a hard time and would have had very difficult decisions to make. But you mentioned specifically kind of international affairs there, things like Ukraine, things like Gaza, and that was where I was always concerned about Jeremy Corbyn getting the keys to number 10. And I'm not just kind of saying that to be tribal, it was what I was hearing on the doorsteps when I was door knocking back in 2019. People raising Jeremy Corbyn proactively without me even mentioning his name, talking about national security, talking about links to the IRA, etc.
Yeah.
And I think that was a large part of the reason why, the Conservative Party did so well, because of that stark choice that Brendan was talking about.
Sure, there is arguably a bigger issue here, which is that Keir Starmer has now refused to repeat that again today. Yep. So he was asked again today numerous times, so do you stand by what you said? And he refused to engage in that. I do think there's a bigger picture here, which is, do we have any idea what this chap really thinks? Or does he tell us what he really thinks and then realises it might be a bit unpopular and then rows back on it?
Well, I think this is going to be his Achilles heel when he gets into government, to be quite honest with you. You can see Labour members who voted for him to be leader who are going, hang on, you said you were like some left-wing socialist who's going to nationalise everything, and now you're sort of saying you didn't believe in any of that in the first place. He's kind of got away with it, I think. And it's, look, politically, to be cynical, it makes kind of sense for him. I think it will catch up with him at some point. And the did you or did you not really support Jeremy Corbyn thing is, I think, the first time the public, rather than, say, politicos and Labour Party members, have actually looked at him and gone, hang on, what do you actually believe? And he's found it quite hard to actually put that out in simple terms.
Yeah, and brother, this is one of the big issues hanging over Sir Keir Starmer's head at the moment, which is, what does he actually really think? This is a bloke who stood on 9 pledges. Now a load of those have been reversed. He's now saying he's putting country before party. He's asking us, is he not, to believe when we vote on July the 4th that we are voting for a completely different man to the man he's been for the last 40 years.
I think when you look at what Keir Starmer's done as leader of the Labour Party, he has stamped out anti-Semitism, he has transformed the Labour Party, and in this election, the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, isn't even running as a Labour candidate. So in that sense, I think we can look at Keir and go, he is prepared to make tough decisions to change institutions, the Labour Party. We know what he did when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. The Labour Party's laid out its manifesto, and I think actually in Keir we've got someone who might not be the flashiest and most showman of leaders, but is a serious guy for the serious times this country's facing.
Can I just ask you on that, the Director, this comes up a lot when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. Did he not just do his job?
He did do his job, but I think he did it very well. And he prosecuted terrorists in Northern Ireland, criminal gangs, etc. Yes, that was his job. But actually, that sort of experience that he had in tackling those sorts of issues, I think is something...
And defending them in the ECHR as well?
Well, something you wanted a Prime Minister, I think. The fact that someone is prepared to take on tough opposition and make firm decisions. And I think, given the state the country's in at the moment, he's exactly the sort of man we need.
There was another, I think, trap, really, in a sense that Keir Starmer fell into. This is on illegal immigration. So... he was asked repeatedly, what are you going to do about the Bibi Stockholm? Are you going to get rid of it? Are you going to get rid of it? And he kept saying, well, this is a visible sign of the Tories' failure, that we've got a barge and it's full of people who've arrived in this country illegally. But he actually can't answer it. He can't answer what he will do. And this is something that Rishi Sunak has been trying to push him on, saying that... basically, the Tories' plan for illegal immigration might not necessarily be working, but at least they've got a plan and Labour don't. Do you buy that or not?
I mean, I do. You wouldn't expect me to say anything otherwise, would you? But I think it's something that I notice in Starmer a lot when he is being interviewed. He likes to talk around a question. I'm not saying evade necessarily, but not talk himself into corners. Whereas I think what a lot of the public like is a politician who just gives straight answers. And so when asked about something like Bibi Stockholm, would you keep it, would you not? To talk around that issue and not give a clear indication. And the answer may be, we don't know yet. We need to get into power and look at what the situation is and then we'll review it. But that's still at least a straight answer rather than just flowery talk.
Yeah, indeed. And this is, again, coming back to something we were talking about just a moment ago, Sean, which is that there are a series of direct questions like this. What are you going to do about the Bibi Stockholm barge? He's had numerous members of his shadow cabinet saying that this barge shouldn't exist. OK, we are about to get, it looks like, we had a record day in the Channel the other day. From what we've been told here at GB News, that's going to continue. The French are coming off the beaches to help police the Olympics. They've also got now a rush of people being forced through the continent by these human traffickers, trying to get to England before the European Union countries maybe impose some tougher rules. So Keir Starmer could conceivably have a migrant crisis wallop right on day one to deal with. He doesn't seem to have any plans, does he?
If he has got plans, he hasn't really set them out in any great detail. I mean, look, this is the Labour Party strategy across a whole load of things. They are not setting out things in a lot of detail. The manifesto is very thin. It is a conscious political strategy. It's a sensible one, because they're so far ahead, they just want to not make mistakes. I think it stores up problems when they get into power, and they have to do a lot of things, some of which are going to be unpopular, and then I think a lot of people are probably going to then turn around and go, hang on, you never told us you were going to do all of this when you were campaigning. And I think what we're seeing on him getting tough questions about Corbyn is probably going to come in the first few months when he becomes Prime Minister.
Well, I'll just stick with this, because what is the Liberal Democrats' view on things like the Bibby Stockholm and what's going on in the Channel?
Look, the Liberal Democrat position will be, I'm no longer a Liberal Democrat spokesman, so I'll be a little bit more free. It's obviously going to be more of a pro-immigration position. They will take a position probably not that dissimilar to what Labour are saying, which is, well, you need more international cooperation, you need to deal with things at the source and so on. They're not going to get into what they would see as being like anti-immigrant rhetoric. That's the sort of... So the way with the Lib Dems, you always go, and Labour do this as well, the more sort of left wing of politics, is you always say, well, we've got to deal with the problems at source, we've got to cooperate with the French, we've got to cooperate across Europe. That is all, by the way, sensible stuff that you do need to do. I think there are a lot of voters in constituencies where they're seeing the impact on the ground. You hear that and go, yeah, but we're not sure that's
right. That phrase there about not wanting to engage in the rhetoric, some people watching this and listening to this now might say, well, if you're not engaging in the rhetoric, then you're not willing to actually necessarily tackle the problem. And Deanna, I'll whiz it back over to you, because this is kind of a Tory-related issue now, which is that not maybe part of the reason why Nigel Farage is doing so well? I saw a poll just before I came on air today. Apparently, Reform are at 20%, the Tories are down at 19%. And it's because he is saying this stuff, isn't it?
I don't know. I mean, you look at the migration issue, and it is an issue. It's been an issue for a number of years now. You know, it's not comfortable seeing numbers rising, crossing the Channel. And yet, you know, what I would say is the Conservative Party has tried to get legislation through Parliament that will address some of the issue. It's not the whole hog. Of course, there does have to be more international cooperation. Of course, there does. We need to re-engage with the French, make sure they're pulling their weight as much as they should be doing. But some of the measures we're taking are actually going to be really positive. I think about James Cleverly with the numbers around migrant visas, etc., to try and get those numbers down, earnings limits, all that sort of thing. It's steps, it's positive, and it's tangible. And at the moment, we seem to be kind of the only party that's coming up with tangible solutions to this problem. They might not be the be-all and end-all, and I'm open to suggestions, of course I am, but at least there is something tangible on the table that voters can vote for rather than rhetoric.
Yeah, and Brendan as well, this is a problem that the Labour Party have said that there's currently around 90,000 people, it's probably a few thousand more now since that figure was released, but around 90,000 people who, under the Conservatives' Legal Migration Act, were never going to be able to even claim for asylum in this country. But Labour are saying that they would give them the opportunity to do that. So let's see how many of them would stay. You also get this massive influx that we are expecting over the summer. You get the fact that we might now be out of step with continental Europe when it comes to our attitude and policies there. Is there not a genuine risk that the Labour government, with the Home Secretary Vivek Cooper, with the refugees welcome sign, you know, might end up actually becoming some kind of magnet for these people in a way that even more than we are?
I think there's no doubt that on July the 5th, if Keir Starmer is Prime Minister and Vivek Cooper's Home Secretary, the first issue they're going to have is the summer migration crisis.
Yeah.
I live in Kent. This has been going on for years. And on July the 5th, the small boat crossings and the asylum claims are not going to suddenly stop. Given, as you've just said, the French are going to be policing the Olympics, it's going to get worse. Now, the question is, what's the Labour government going to do about it? They've said they're going to increase the border security forces and beef that area up. That's not going to happen overnight. Takes time to recruit and train people, etc. I think, frankly, for the first year, whether it's a Tory government or a Labour government, we're going to have a summer of a migration crisis. I don't necessarily agree that Labour's going to be, come on, everyone come in, because, frankly, the country's in such a mess and we don't have the money to accommodate so many new arrivals. The government will have to take a more firmer line, which, as Blair did when he won.
And just on this, because last night, Sir Ed Davey, I think I'm right in saying this, refused to categorically rule out a coalition with Labour, I think. So my thinking with this is if we end up with an election scenario where there needs to be some kind of coalition, which is not the likeliest outcome at the moment.
I appreciate the fantasy of it.
Presumably, some of the Lib Dems' red lines would be pave the way to rejoin the European Union and, well, not more of what we see in the Channel, but certainly not doing that much to stop it, I would have thought.
No, I'm not sure about that, actually. I think Ed Davey's a pretty realistic politician. I don't think he's going to go in and go, you know, the two things we're going to want to be remembered for on the Lib Dems is going to be, you know, two incredibly, frankly, unpopular policies. I think he probably would want more cooperation on things like single market and see if there's more he could do there. But he's been quite canny in this election. I think he'd avoid any kind of trap like that in the wildly unlikely circumstance you've outlined.
All right, yeah, well, indeed, you never know, though. You never know. OK, right, well, look, stay tuned because we've got a heck of a lot more coming your way. We're going to be hearing from Rishi Sunak as well, a couple of clips from him from last night. But I suppose the main event of this show, anyway, is that we're going to be hearing from Sir Keir Starmer very, very shortly. Rishi will also be sanctioning young people, though, apparently, for not complying to mandatory national service, which is a great talking point, if nothing else. Very keen to see how you feel about that. Plus, Sir Ed Davey, will he ever sink that legacy of perceived coalition chaos? Stay tuned.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. GB News, Britain's election channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
3 years ago, the small town of Evanston proudly became the first local government in the... It's just outside Chicago, by the way. The first local government in the US to start paying slavery reparations to its black citizens. But now the council is being sued in a federal court for exhibiting exactly the sort of prejudice it decries. By saying, well, basically, you know, the Hispanics, the white people, they are being discriminated against because they're not getting anything.
The people that were compensated were people that were adults between 1919 and 1969. Now, they lived under a time, in terms of education, in terms of the job market, they were literally barred from having certain jobs, going to certain healthcare clinics and going to certain schools. So that is a set of very distinct challenges that white people, Hispanic people, Asian people did not face. So that is precisely why they've been compensated in this way. And I think it's about £20,000 it works out to. I would have given him a lot more.
But you see, the thing is, history, we learn from history and we move on, and people evolve. And in order to reach a certain goal and a certain level of parity, which is what we all want to do, and through no way of levelling up, and this is a form of levelling up, by the way, it's nothing else, and it's divisive and it's patronising, I think it's absolutely disgusting. There were people in modern history who were discriminated against constantly, and I think it's so divisive to keep going back, to keep reiterating, to keep saying, oh, poor you. Between 1919 and 1969, you couldn't get a mortgage. Well, that was wrong. No one's saying it was right. But do we need to be compensated for that?
The legal challenge is saying that this is creating more divisions.
Yes.
The past is affecting the present, but not in a good way.
The People's Channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking... This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again. Down to earth. It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it? And most importantly, honest. Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them. Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akweer, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled. Lovely.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Vote 2024, The Leaders. Now, during last night's BBC Question Time, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said that if 18-year-olds were to refuse his proposed compulsory national service, then they may face sanctions such as losing their driving licence or limiting their access to certain finances. Although he didn't specify exactly what that means, when asked whether or not this would include denying young people of their bank cards, his response was simply, there's a lot of different models around Europe. Which, to be fair, there are a lot of different models around Europe, but I think we can hear from him now.
Have a set of sanctions and incentives, and we will look at the models that are existing around Europe to get the appropriate mix of those. There's a range of different options that exist.
For example?
There's all sorts of things that people do across Europe, whether that's looking at driving licences, other access to finance, all sorts of other things. There's a range of things, and we will have a Royal Commission look at all of those, come back to the government and recommend what the appropriate mix of incentives and sanctions is.
OK, so here with me to discuss all of this is the former Conservative Minister, Deanna Davison. I've also got former Head of Media for the Lib Dems, it's Sean Kemp, and the Labour Councillor, Brendan Chilton. Deanna, I'll start with you on this. A lot of our viewers love this idea of national service. They do. And I do wonder whether or not they might think that, all right, if you refuse to do it, then there are some consequences. What do you think?
So I don't like it as a policy. I'll say that from the get-go. But I think if you're going to do national service, you've got to do it properly for it to really mean the sort of things that we're implying it means. If it's to improve patriotism, improve sense of worth, develop skills and have that military angle, then it has to be a military national service. And yet that's not necessarily what's being proposed. As we know, it's either, I think 30,000 places in the military per year or volunteering, I think, 1 weekend a month to kind of gain some skills, which are two very different things. And kind of I worry that we're being a little bit inconsistent in our policy here as well, because you look at the fact that we are promoting apprenticeships, people to go on, do apprenticeships, start their working life earlier, start to earn their own money, make their own decisions. And yet, are we going to pull them out of those apprenticeships at 18 to do this? It seems very backwards to me. And at a point when we're talking about what we want for our young people, we want them to work hard, get on the housing ladder, I really don't see how this is going to particularly help. OK, all right. I suppose just taking it at face value, Sean, if somebody actively refused to do one of the two things which are on offer, which is to do a year's actual military service or to do things like deliver prescriptions to the elderly 1 weekend a month, which I don't think is that much of a big deal, personally, then, yeah, all right, they should have consequences. You don't want to be a spoilt brat all your life, do you?
I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the idea of... I don't mind the idea of, frankly, some kind of national volunteer service that people can be incentivised to sign up to. I think there's a lot to recommend it. I don't think I really like the idea of the fact that you can just go around and order 18-year-olds to give up their weekend, and if they can't, you're going to chop up their bank cards. I think that's a slightly odd way for any government to interfere in people's lives. And that's the problem for Rishi Sunak, is he's trying to describe something that in one way is quite sensible policy. They do in lots of countries about encouraging young people to volunteer. So you'll tell a heartwarming story like he did on that debate about St John's Ambulance and people learning crucial medical skills. But then he remembers he's also got to make it sound like it is something it's not, which is forcing everyone to join the army. So he goes, and if you don't do that, there'll be these terrible consequences. If he's honest about it, I think he'd have a lot of people more widely across the country, including quite a few young people, who go, yeah, it sounds all right to me, but he's not actually being honest about what the policy is.
Well, all right, OK. Brendan, I mean, the other really big policy for kids at this election is the Labour one, which is enfranchising them with the vote. And when you look at those two things side by side, I do wonder whether or not national service is better.
Well, I personally don't agree with the votes at 16. I don't agree with the national service element either. I think the best thing we can do for our young people actually is train them in setting up their own businesses, encouraging more people to take on apprenticeships and get to university. If they want to volunteer in the community, fine, but I don't think we should be mandating anything. The issue with votes at 16 is if you lower the voting age and you say you can vote at 16, the next thing is, well, why can't we stand for election at 16? And you could... conceivably have a situation where 16-year-olds can vote but then can't run in an election, and that I don't think is entirely democratic.
Well, it's a good point, and one that I must say I've not really heard before. I think you would have to let them run for election, wouldn't you?
You would, and you'd then have a situation where children that are meant to be staying in education, training or work up until they're 16 could potentially be sitting where Deanna was sitting a few weeks ago in the Commons at the same time. They'd have to give their teacher a sick note or something to get out of class to do it. But it isn't inconceivable.
But they can't buy a pint in Strangers Bar at the end of the night.
Ah, that's true.
A self-respecting teenager would run that.
Wayne's been on. Wayne says, hit them with a £5,000 fine if they don't need national service. Look, Wayne, I'm not against that in principle. The only problem is we would all end up paying that £5,000 fine, unfortunately. I get where you're coming from, but they're not going to pay it back, are they? If they can't be bothered to get off the backsides 1 weekend a month and deliver a prescription to Dorothy at number 42, then we're not seeing that £5,000 again, mate. But there you go. I mean, what are the Lib Dems going to do for young people as well, though? Because you also want to let them vote, don't you, Ellie?
They also would support votes at 60. I'm such a disassociated.
How disassociated are you now?
I'm a very loyal Lib Dem. I've never, even at at the time, when I was working for them, I was never a fan of vote 16. Partly just because I think it's a bit illogical. You're seeing generally in society, for good or ill, we're actually raising the age thresholds on a lot of things. We seem to be treating 18 as the age when you're an adult and you can buy a drink and all the rest of it.
Energy drinks, all that stuff, yeah.
And then we say, but on voting, you're going to lower it. I get the arguments for it, but I don't think the benefits of it are really going to come from... I don't see actually what the benefits of it are. I know I sound most solid. I do believe in PR, I promise.
I think surely the better thing, if we want young people to feel engaged in the democratic process, is to actually teach them about it properly at school, teach them how it works, teach them the impacts of their decisions when they vote, how to scrutinise policy, how to not get taken in by a dodgy TikTok. I think that's the more important thing we need to do to get young people invested.
Well, and I do also wonder, there's a lot of talk of, this is vote rigging, isn't it? Because what they'll do is they'll, naturally, if you're not left-wing at 16, then, you haven't got a heart or whatever they say, and then, how are they really going to vote? I can see a future where there are minibuses put on from schools, and I don't think that's an unreasonable thing. Oh, come on, it's polling day, and remember what the Tories are going to do to your school if you don't vote for Labour. I can see that happening. But I wonder if that could backfire, Deanna, because there is the capacity, I think, for especially young men to be quite right-wing, actually.
Well, you're right, and there have been some kind of attitude surveys done recently that show young men are tending towards being more right-wing and becoming more right-wing as they age, whereas young women are going the other way. I'm representing for the Progressive Alliance here.
Right, well, there you go.
No, so I think you're right. I think were there to be, a charismatic, young, kind of cool, social media savvy candidate who's particularly right-wing, then they could definitely go down quite well with young men and scoop up some of those votes. The question, though, is about the demographics of how many of each of those votes sits per constituency, because actually I'm not convinced that there would be enough per constituency necessarily to sway things in a really dramatic fashion.
OK, all right. Your views on that, whether or not the youth might actually swing to the right?
I think it's entirely possible. If you look across the Channel, in Germany and in France and in Holland, the support for the right, hard right in those countries, is coming largely from younger voters. And although we're not identical to those European countries, as Deanna just said, if you had that sort of character here that could win them over, it's not inconceivable young people, particularly boys, could go to the right.
Yeah, I think so as well. Right, OK, well, there's still a heck of a lot more to go through, because we are going to be talking a little bit more now exclusively about the Lib Dems. Whether or not Davey will be able to come back from some of the criticisms that he's had over tuition fees and the post office scandal, etc, etc, etc. And yes, we are going to be hearing from Sir Keir Starmer. Christopher Hope, our political editor, has been doing a sit-down interview with the Labour leader, the man who, as the polls suggest at the moment, is most likely to go on and be your next Prime Minister. So stay tuned for all of that.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update from the Met Office. This weekend will be a little bit cloudier than the week has been, but it's still going to be warm. But next week will be even warmer. For the time being, though, we've got a few weather fronts still moving in from the west. That's going to introduce quite a lot of cloud from western areas, but also some rain through this evening for parts of Wales, northwestern England, much of Scotland, down into the southwest as well through this evening. And that's going to push eastwards through the night, introducing more cloud to central and eastern areas by tomorrow morning. Now, behind that, it does turn much clearer across parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland. We could see temperatures as low as 5 degrees for Northern Ireland, but for many of us, another fairly mild start to the day. However, sunshine is going to be slightly more limited very first thing tomorrow, but for much of Scotland, it should be a fairly bright start to the day. They will likely see a bit more cloud across eastern areas of Scotland, perhaps into the far northwest as well. A risk of the odd shower, but for many areas of Northern Ireland and Scotland, a bright start to the day. Elsewhere, across parts of northeast England, a cloudy start to the day. Some drizzly rain as well across eastern areas of England, but for much of Wales and the southwest, still fairly bright. And that sunshine will become a bit more widespread throughout Saturday. The cloud's going to break up and lift up, and that will allow a few showers to break out here and there across eastern areas of England. But I think most of us should stay dry through the day on Saturday. And in that sunshine, still feeling fairly warm. We've got very high UV levels and very high pollen levels. Temperatures climbing towards 24 degrees across the southeast, but widely into the low 20s. Another warm day to come on Sunday. There is more cloud arriving from the west through the day, though, so it will likely be another cloudy start, this time across Wales, northwestern England and into the southwest. But once again, it will brighten up as the day goes on. And in that sunshine, it will feel very warm, turning even warmer, though, Monday and into Tuesday as temperatures climb to the mid to high 20s.
This is GB News, and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians in the media, but it's actually about you.
And we won't ever forget that. Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
Now more than ever, it's important to hear
all sides as you make your decision ahead of polling day.
We're here for you.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's election channel.
GB News is Britain's election channel.
And when the big stories break, we're tackling them on Britain's newsroom. When we disagree, and we disagree a lot, it's even livelier than normal.
We don't disagree that much.
We do.
His comedy, though, is revolting.
I knew her, unlike you. That explains Beverly Turner's temperament.
It's a bit frothy in here, isn't it?
He'll have one of me one day.
For dartball practice. Britain's newsroom on GB News. Weekdays, 9:30 a.m.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Vote 2024, The Leaders. Now, shortly, we are going to be hearing from Sir Keir Starmer. He's done a big sit-down interview with our political editor, Christopher Hope. It'll be fascinating to see what he has to say there, won't it? But before that, let's talk about another one of the leaders, and it is Sir Ed Davey. Well, the last time that the Lib Dems made promises on tuition fees, they failed to keep them after partnering with David Cameron's Conservatives in what some now refer to as the coalition of chaos. That failure of the Lib Dems to keep their promises caused the party to lose a significant number of seats at the subsequent general election. It's fair to say it wasn't just the tuition fees issue, but it didn't help. However, the current party leader, Sir Ed Davey, now insists the party have learned from those mistakes. Shall we have a little listen to Sir Ed? No? OK, why not? Anyway, here with me to discuss this is the former Conservative Minister, Deanna Davison, former head of media for the Lib Dems, Sean Kemp, the Labour councillor, Brendan Chilton. I'll tell you what he said. He said, look, we've learned from our mistakes. That's basically what he said. Is that fair enough? Is there not a credibility gap here when it comes to Sir Ed Davey on tuition fees, on him prattling about in Windermere and doing all these kind of stunts, on the post office scandal, etc.? I mean, has he really got what it takes to potentially be a leader of the opposition in a couple of weeks?
I think he's done pretty well at this election. I think he did pretty well last night, actually, because a lot of times Lib Dems have done those things, previous leaders, and they've really struggled because they've just tried to justify it all and pretend it wasn't that bad. What he did quite well was go, yeah, we got it wrong. I mean, I'm not going to make that mistake again. I made mistakes. And actually, he then got a bit more of a hearing because people were prepared to listen to someone actually admitting they made a mistake.
Does he get enough of a rough ride, though, to be fair? Because we have got a recent example of what the Lib Dems have been like in government, and they were rubbish, weren't they?
Well, I mean, you say coalition of chaos. I'd say that was the last period of functioning government this country's had, quite frankly. I think what is true is the Lib Dems are always going to get punished, and Angela Merkel once said the smaller party in the coalition always gets smashed because the point of coalitions is you compromise. And I think voters don't expect that, certainly in British politics. You go into a coalition, you go into government, your government should do everything you should do. And look, the Lib Dems have deserved to get punished a bit. We did as a party. We'd campaigned on tuition fees, then we said, no, we're not doing it.
You also allowed there to be a bit of a rubbish referendum on AV, wasn't it?
On AV.
Which is not even really what you particularly wanted, was it? You wanted PR?
No, but I suspect all your reform voting viewers wish we'd won that now, don't they? So, actually, with hindsight, maybe, some people might think it would have been better if we'd have won it. Because I think you're seeing now the flaws, the first past post system, seeing parties on nearly 20% of the vote who are going to win like 3 or 4 seats, maybe.
OK, well, fair enough. Now, we are not going to give either of you too much of a chance now to come back on the Liberal Democrats, I'm afraid. So sorry about this, everybody. But I'm kind of not sorry, because it's the main event now. And it's time for Sir Keir Starmer. This is the Labour leader who has just been interviewed by our political editor, Christopher Hope. I believe it's quite a wide-ranging interview, so we'll take you to the very first part of that now.
Keir Starmer, we're here in a pub in Harlow, in Essex.
Very nice. Friday night.
Friday night. Cheers.
Cheers. Very good to see you.
Cheers. Have a drink with GB News, exactly. 40,000 majority. Who are the working people you want to cut taxes for if you become Prime Minister?
Working people are people who work for a living, they pay their national insurance, they pay their income tax, and they, broadly speaking, don't have the sort of wherewithal to write a big cheque when they get into trouble financially. Now, that will be many millions of people who don't have very much in savings. It now would actually cover quite a lot of people who do have savings, but, as any working person knows who's got savings, you work hard, you put those savings aside, normally for a car, a holiday, possibly a house or a deposit, for yourself or your children, you certainly don't want to be using that money for energy bills or cost of living crises. It's those people who rely on our public services and work for a living, and that's why I've said for working people, no increase in income tax, in national insurance or VAT. I think they're already paying too high a price under this government.
Sure, you're thinking a bit about your dad. I mean, he obviously was a toolmaker, worked in a factory. Is there a bit of snobbery, do you think, in Britain towards blue-collar workers?
Well, I do. I mean, my dad worked in a factory, and he did feel pretty well all of his life that people looked down on him. And Chrissy hated that discussion in any social gathering you have where people say, well, when they meet for the first time, what do you do for a living? And he would be familiar with the discussion that went, well, you know, I work for the local authority, I'm a lawyer, and he would say, I work in a factory. And there would be a sort of gap, a silence, probably not that long, but for him, he knew why it was there, which is people didn't know what to say next, and he felt disrespected. So yes, it's working people, and you know, that really matters, that respect at work, the security. But these days, working people who don't have the wherewithal to sort of write a cheque to get out of financial difficulties, quite a big group now under this government.
So working people with a few £1,000s of savings, that's about it. That's who you're thinking about, who you want to help the most if you become Prime Minister.
Yeah, it could be more savings actually, but if you're a working person and you work really hard and you put your money in the bank to save, it's normally for a real purpose. You know, it could be you're wanting a bigger deposit on a bigger house, it could be a holiday, a special Christmas, special occasion. What you don't want, if you've worked really hard, and you know, I really understand this because it's, you know, working people, it's really deep in me. If you've worked really hard and put that money in the bank for a special occasion, to then have to draw it out because public services aren't what they are, you can't pay your bills, that is something which is really hard for working people.
Just on tax, we've asked our viewers and listeners for questions for you. Stephen West is concerned about income tax thresholds. Will you lift them? The Tories say they'll lift them after 2028 and stop nurses and teachers paying the higher rate of tax. Will you do the same?
Well, I do want to bring those taxes down, but I'm not going to make promises that are unfunded. I think that's the big mistake that Liz Truss made. She made promises that were unfunded, tax cuts in her case. And the economy took a battering and working people are paying the price.
But you both are banking on growth, aren't you? For your Truss wanted growth, you want growth.
Yes.
So you've taken some lessons from Truss in a way?
I haven't taken any lessons from Truss. Well, at least I've taken one lesson, which is never, ever, ever have unfunded commitments because working people pay the price. There'll be people watching, Chris, your viewers, who have maybe been on a fixed rate mortgage for a number of years, coming off now, get a new mortgage and it's gone up several £100s, and you know they are really paying the price. So that's the lesson from Truss: never do that again. Stabilise the economy, but also grow the economy.
Yeah. There are numbers out today on benefits. 25 billion paid on benefits last month, and in here I can't find evidence you want to cut the benefits bill. The Tories are saying they'll cut it by, I think it's 12 billion or so by 2028-29. Why are you happy not to leave that number unchallenged?
Well, just on the Tories numbers, the money they say that they found in their manifesto to fund their commitment
was announced in November last year.
Unfortunately, Jeremy Hunt, the Charles said, I'm afraid that money's already accounted for. But my approach,
it's too big.
It is very big, and we do need to get that number down. There's no doubt about that. And that's why what you will find in our manifesto is our back to work plan. Many people on long-term sickness, we need to get them back into the workplace. 2 or 3 ways of doing that. Businesses will support this. I've been to see some of these initiatives. So many people are able to get back into work if they're supported back into work. And I want to radically restructure the job centres.
And bring down the cost of benefits.
Well, I was really surprised that job centres are not places where businesses go to find the people they need for the vacancies. So there's a mismatch there. So I want to bring together career service
in the old days, they were.
And job centres. So it can't be just a way of dispensing benefits. It's got to be a real shop front for business, and we want businesses to say that is the place we will go
and bring down the bill,
and therefore bring down the bill and get people back. It's a double benefit. You bring down the welfare bill, but also you get people back into work, which massively helps the economy.
Other taxes, new council tax bans, yes or no? Is that the idea?
No, we're not. You know, all of our plans are fully costed, fully funded.
But wealth are not mentioned here, council tax.
Yeah, we're fully funded, fully costed. Every single plan in this very good manifesto is funded. We've said where the money comes from, and they don't require tax rises. But what I'm not going to do, Chris, and I'll be very straight with you, is I'm not going to write 5 years' worth of budgets 2 or 3 weeks before the election.
A lot of our viewers are drivers. They worry about the fuel duty. We're in Halfond country, Robert Halfond country. He got the fuel duty frozen. Will you keep that fuel duty free?
On fuel duty, obviously, we're very sensitive to this because we know how impactful it is. Every year we've supported the position of keeping that frozen. It's a budget-by-budget issue, but I would say to anyone who's concerned on this, check our track record on this. I would also
That's a big hint for GBNews viewers, isn't it?
Well, we've always said freeze the fuel duty, so that's our long history. That's been our commitment, and we do it for a purpose. We know why. The other thing I'd say is we've got a plan for potholes, because if you're a driver, you are driven beyond frustration by potholes. So we've got a plan to deal with potholes, and that will, because if your vehicle gets damaged, it costs several £100 usually, and if you use a van or a vehicle for work, you're also without your vehicle for however long it takes to get repaired. So we've got to fix that.
OK, so that was the first part of a two-part interview with Sir Keir Starmer and our political editor Christopher Hope. I'll just rattle through some of the questions that were asked there. Essentially, what is a working person? Asked a bit about his dad, whether or not the old my dad was a toolmaker thing is a bit of snobbery when people laugh at that. So there's no plans to cut benefits, which I think is interesting. I mean, there was £11 billion worth of benefits fraud in the last year and a bit. I mean, there's an entire town in Bulgaria that's been built as a result of benefits fraud, actually. New council tax bans, he didn't rule it out. Kind of at this point, maybe you can take that as a yes. Obviously, Sir Keir Starmer would deny that wholeheartedly. Brendan, I'll start with you on this. He expanded what his view of a working person was there to include people who may have savings, but they've worked for those savings. I mean, it's everyone, isn't it?
It's a perfectly logical explanation of what a working person is, and it just shows the insight that Keir Starmer has into the people of our country and why he's so far ahead in the polls, Patrick.
Do I detect that maybe you think he might actually be a bit out of touch with most people?
No. I think everybody knows what a working person is. I think the thrust of his argument was that description. Yes, it was a bit convoluted, but actually there's a large number of people in the country that have got barely any savings or very little savings. Large number of people who, because of the last few years, are struggling with mortgage payments, etc. And I think what he's trying to do is put Labour in that position to show those people in the country, which are many millions, we're on your side, we know how it feels, I've come from that background, and so you can relate to me and trust me as Prime Minister.
Let's talk a little bit about that background. Diana, I'll ask you about this, because for me, I'm not sure if I quite buy this line that my dad was a toolmaker and he used to really hate social situations where people would say to him, what do you do? And then they would be very snobby about it. Now, there are some incredibly snobby people out there, but it just made me think, if Keir Starmer's dad was really a quotes-unquote working person, I mean, who's he hanging out with that would be incredibly snobbish towards him?
Yeah, I don't want to get into like a working class off with Keir Starmer at all, but I reflected on that myself and thought about kind of where my dad would be like hanging out on a weekend after work, whatever. And it was with his mates who went to the same school as him and grew up in a very similar background to him. He would never have really had those conversations except on very one-off specific events, maybe at like a wedding or something, with me. I was very privileged, got a scholarship to a private school. Maybe going to my school, he might have felt a bit uncomfortable. But broadly, Dad would never really have been in that situation.
Yeah, I don't know how you feel about that. I'm just not quite sure. Because the only reason I'm asking, and you're right to say, let's not get into a working class off with someone. Yeah, but, I mean, he has made a virtue of it. This is the thing, and I'm just not quite sure how true it is.
Well, I mean, I'm going to choose to, on this one, believe Keir Starmer saying what he says about his family. The reason why he talks about it a lot, I think, is partly just to show, that he's connected to what people think, and if he's patronising phrase, ordinary people's lives, but also because there has been a concerted attempt to paint him as being quite posh. Like, the Conservative Party did try and say Sir Keir Starmer, trying to imply that he's like a peer.
Yeah.
And he's really... And so he's deliberately trying to go, no, hang on, I've actually someone who's got a pretty impressive background and life story of having sort of pulled himself up. So he's trying to sort of counteract that a bit. He just overdoes it, I think.
Okay. I think you're right, and I think the problem, sorry, Patrick, very quickly, is that I think it eats into that authenticity, and I think what most voters are looking for in any politician and any leader is authenticity, and it just doesn't quite come across with Keir, whether it's true or not.
It looks a bit like he's very, which I can understand, by the way, but like he's very scared of having the clangor that cost him the election. And with respect, I think having a pint with Christopher Hope, that clangor's not going to happen, right? So maybe he could be a bit more loose, but then we'll see. Maybe he's had a few more pints now.
I didn't see him touch that pint.
Not cutting benefits. So we have a massive benefit state. We have a lot of people, especially some younger people, who I think it's fair to say could be working and aren't. And Labour don't seem to want to do too much about that, keeping a big burden on the taxpayer.
I think if you look at the overall policy of the policy is growth, stability, jobs and work. Of course, you know, nobody wants to see people languishing on benefits. If you look at the UK compared to the rest of Europe, we do actually have one of the toughest and strictest welfare arrangements on the continent of Europe. I think the idea that we're not going to reduce benefits further at the moment is sensible, because we have just had the last 2 years extremely difficult.
Is Labour the party to actually try to revolutionise our benefit system, to get people off their backsides and into work if they can? Or is it going to be easy for people to remain on the take?
Well, I think under the last Labour government, they did pretty well on this. You know, we had record levels of employment, particularly youth employment, and I think under Keir Starmer, we've obviously got to get in, look at the books and face the economic storms this country's facing. But I think if you go by what we've said and what we've done in government in the past, you can rely on Labour to get people back into work.
All right, now I'm being shouted at a little bit here because we do have part 2 of this GB News exclusive interview with Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer. That's coming your way in just a second or two, so stay tuned.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
98-year-old veteran Ken Cook shared his memories of D-Day at a special event in Harrogate. As a former Green Howards private, Ken was part of an armada of vessels carrying more than 150,000 Allied soldiers to France. And he was just a teenager when his regiment landed on Gold Beach in Normandy.
Everybody was telling us, the officers and the sergeants, corporals, they tell get off the beach, lads, quick, because there's some more stuff coming behind us, and they had to get onto the beach as well. All our equipment and tanks and whatever, artillery, they were following up behind us, so we had to get out of the way and get into the countryside and make as much ground as we could on that first day.
Ken survived that harrowing first day, but many didn't. Around 10,000 Allied troops were either killed or injured. But their sacrifice, along with the bravery of those that lived, changed the course of history and resulted in the end of World War II.
Because somebody had to do it, and so we did it. We did our job, and that's it.
Ken is one of the last surviving members of York's Normandy veterans. Part of an ever-dwindling band of brothers who fought on D-Day, he's attending the 80th commemoration in France.
A very emotional occasion this time, because there's not many of us left now.
Remembering the fallen, Ken's wish is that long after he's gone, we still never forget those who gave their tomorrow for our today.
The People's Channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m, followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain, followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Vote 2024, The Leaders. And in just a few minutes' time, you're going to be hearing, well, in fact, a few seconds' time, we're going to be hearing a heck of a lot more from Sir Keir Starmer. But our political editor, Christopher Hope, did sit down with him earlier on. It's 2 weeks out from the day that he could potentially take the keys to Downing Street. We do have part two of this interview for you, just to quickly whiz you through what he's already spoken about. He's spoken about whether or not he's going to raise council tax, and particularly give an answer on that. What are they going to do about cutting the benefits bill? He was also asked a couple of other things about whether or not people found his dad being a toolmaker, whether or not he thought it was a bit snobbish that people were chuckling away at that. And he was grilled a bit on what is a working person. But let's find out what Sir Keir Starmer has got to say now.
Dash for energy is worrying, green energy is worrying people. Will you ensure that you don't do it at the expense of family budgets, which, I mean, the Tories have weakened their plans, their targets to do that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's very important that we make the transition to green energy because it's cheaper, it's more secure, but we mustn't do it in a way which impacts on people disproportionately. We're going to set up GB Energy, a publicly owned energy company, and that will actually drive down energy bills, not just for a short time, but for good, because I know that particularly in the last 2 years, so many people have been absolutely clobbered with the high energy bills which they can't afford, and businesses as well, like this pub.
Quite right. On the small boats crisis, Sheila Traynor wants to ask you about this. Do you want to stop the boats? Your manifesto says stop the chaos, not stop the boats. Will you guarantee to GBNews viewers you will cut the number of crossings by migrants across the Channel in year one of your premiership?
Well, look, we want to get those numbers down. Nobody should be making that journey. And the way to do that is to tackle the gangs that are running this vile trade. There are gangs making an absolute fortune, putting vulnerable people in boats, running this trade, in breach of our borders, record numbers this year. Nobody should make that crossing. So we want to set a border security command, a new command, an elite command, bringing together all of our police and law enforcement, which will have new powers, counter-terrorism powers, to smash these gangs. And I've done it before when I was chief prosecutor with terrorist gangs.
You work closely with them.
We can do it again. We've got to stop this business of people crossing the Channel in small boats.
I don't want to talk about betting too much, but will you bet me a pint of beer that in year one you'll bring down the undercrossings?
Chris, betting in politics
it's not allowed anymore.
Is a very, very bad idea. I think Rishi Sunak's in all sorts of trouble with bets on his side.
Just on that, do you think it's time the Gambling Commission asked him for who he told about the July 4th date? Is it time they went to him?
I think he should come clean and say who knew. He should take immediate action against those that are being investigated, suspend his candidate. If they're my candidate, I'd have had them out the door without their feet touching the ground, and show some leadership on this. I have to say there's a deeper point here, Chris, which is about where politics has gone under this government, because the first instinct of some of those Tories in relation to a general election is not what's good for the country, but how quickly can I get to the bookies and make myself some money. I mean, it tells you everything that's wrong with 14 years of chaos and decline.
I'm going to move on quickly because we've got limited time. You've got to get home, see your families now on a Friday night. I know it's very important to you. You're committed to the NHS. I know that. Of course, your mum was treated there. Your wife works there. But you wouldn't pay for private healthcare even if one of your children was ill. Well, I find that amazing as a dad.
Two things, Chris. Firstly, I think the question I was asked was, would I pay for private healthcare to effectively jump the waiting list?
Yes.
I wouldn't. I actually had an operation on my knee some years ago. I waited my turn. But the idea of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who is responsible for bringing waiting lists down, then saying to the public, but so far as I'm concerned, I'm going to jump the list.
But you can afford to. Most people on a good wage do afford it and pay for it.
If I am, elected in to serve as Prime Minister, my job is to bring those waiting lists down, and I'm not going to at the same time say, but for me, I'm going to jump the queue.
Your poor children, if you can afford, you can take the pressure off the waiting list by paying it for it yourself. That's what Margaret Thatcher was said.
No, look, I'm not going to jump the queue when others are waiting that queue. I'm going to reduce the queue. The other thing I should say is this, because there are different ways this question is put. On acute care, people say, well, what if your child was really ill? On acute care, the NHS is absolutely the best, so much so that private hospitals refer into the NHS. So if we had an acute case, I'd want to be treated by the NHS because that's the best place to be.
A chronic issue I'm talking about.
No, I wouldn't. I'm not going to say to the country, I'm going to drive down your waiting list, but I'm going to pay to sort of accelerate myself.
Do you want your cabinet to have the same principles?
Sorry?
Do you want your cabinet to have the same
I'm not ideological about it. I mean, the real political issue here is why so many people feel they've got to go private because they're waiting so long. And we're talking about working people before. These working people are now having to pay for hip replacements, knee replacements, because they can't get them quickly enough on the NHS. That's the disgrace of the waiting list damage that this government has done.
Just quickly on the issue of trust, you say you'd rather Jeremy Corbyn to Boris Johnson. You said why last night on the BBC. I mean, but Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't say he would defend us with nuclear weapons. Why would he be better than Boris Johnson?
Well, at the last election, we had a very poor choice in 2019, and what transpired was obviously Jeremy Corbyn got rejected by the electorate, not the right person, and we've expelled him now from the Labour Party. So that's how far we've changed the Labour Party. Boris Johnson was elected as Prime Minister, and a number of years later was booted out of Parliament for breaking the rules. That's why I've been so determined to change the Labour Party to always say country first, party second, and make sure at this election, there is a real choice between continuing the Tories or now turning a page and rebuilding the country with Labour.
And keeping us safe, you would do that, wouldn't you, if required?
Absolutely. It's the first duty of any Prime Minister, and in the Labour Party we understand that. That's why if you look at the original treaty for NATO, which is deposited in Brussels at the NATO headquarters,
you've been there several times.
It's got Bevan's signature on it, a Labour Secretary of State, a founding member of NATO.
On your patriotism, which is a big issue since we first spoke when you became leader, are you more patriotic than Nigel Farage?
Oh, look, I wouldn't start this business of comparing myself with others.
You have a quieter sense, don't you?
I'm truly patriotic in that my mission, if you like, the very reason I came into politics is to improve our country and improve the lives of millions of people in our country. I'm very proud of our country. I'm very proud to sit in front of the Union Jack. I did it when I represented our country as Chief Prosecutor. But the passion in me, yes, it is perhaps a quiet passion, is to improve this country, to genuinely take it forward. I think most people in this country are reasonable, tolerant, live and let live. They want to get on themselves, they want their family to get on, they want their community to get on, and they want their country to get on. And that's what drives me. Improving our country is my number one goal.
Just your last question to you. Your team want to take you away correctly to see your family. You've been in Scotland all day, I understand that.
They've been looking after me well.
I know. You've been watching the football. Do voters want you as PM? Do they want to Pep Guardiola? Do you worry you might be a bit Gareth Southgate, defensive, indecisive, boring even, Keir Starmer?
No, let's not do that. We've only had 2 games, and England traditionally
they can turn it round.
We don't often win the first game. We're sort of looking like we need to win the 3rd game, so we're in traditional territory. But what you need is a good team, a good strategy, and an absolute steely determination to win. And you need that in politics as well, and I've got it.
OK. So, Keir Starmer, thank you for joining us tonight for GB News. Great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
OK, so that was Sir Keir Starmer there alongside our political editor Christopher Hope. Quite a lot to go at there. I will start with that question. I thought, are you more patriotic than Nigel Farage? I saw Nigel interviewed on the BBC, and Nigel's answer to this, Brendan, was, well, he wouldn't have taken his poppy off. So Keir Starmer had a poppy on, did a video, and then went to do a piece for elements of the British Muslim community, and he took his poppy off. And Nigel used that to beat him with and say, there you go, that shows that he's not particularly patriotic. Is that something that Keir Starmer's going to struggle with?
I don't think so. I don't think, in this country we're quite subtle and discreet about our patriotism. In America, you go, there's flags everywhere. Over here, we've just got this effortless superiority. We know we're the best nation in the world. We don't need to shout about it. And that's where I think Keir's at. He doesn't have to walk around saying, I'm patriotic. I'm constantly going on about it. He has changed the Labour Party from a party where people questioned whether we would be on the right side and whether we would support the country under Jeremy Corbyn. And I think now, as you see, Labour's perfectly comfortable with the flag, singing the national anthem. I know they're sort of very basic tests, but the party has changed.
You see people like Jess Phillips, though, Dennis, don't you, tweeting the odd thing about there's some chap wearing a St George's cross and he was walking home, must have been watching the football. It's like they sneer at those people.
So I saw that tweet and I read it in a completely different way. I read it as if Jess saying, what a lad, he's coming back from the game. I genuinely didn't read it as anything untoward, but I will never forget Emily Thornberry's famous tweet with the house covered in England flags when there was a major tournament on. So sneering, so condescending, whereas actually that's exactly what my street looked like growing up whenever there was a match.
Oh, absolutely. I quite like it when that stuff happens as well. I'll come to you on this, Sean. Is it actually a slight issue, a question mark of patriotism for Labour? Dare I say the Lib Dems as well wants to be so close to the EU?
I don't think in patriotism, no, actually. I think most of the time voters don't really get too caught up in that, are you patriotic? I think the exception, actually, as we heard, was Jeremy Corbyn, because I think...
Quivered on the edge of being actively dangerous.
Yeah, because you're actually, well, hang on, I'm not actually sure which side you might be on in this one. I think beyond that, people are fairly tolerant of. They do assume most people are patriotic. People express it in different ways. But as long as they don't feel you're sneering or they kind of doubt your loyalties, voters are pretty tolerant on this.
All right, well, let's deal with a couple of other big ones now. So, Christopher Hope there asked him whether or not he would reduce channel crossings within a year. Trying to get him to bet him a pint that he would. Keir Starmer would not be drawn on that, just saying, well, essentially, you've got to smash the gangs, and you've got to try and deal with this greater international cooperation as well. I know we touched this a little bit earlier on in the show, but that is his latest line, Brendan, that he will not be drawn on whether or not there will actually be fewer boat crossings under a Labour government.
I think from a sort of electoral point of view, and in the election, it's very sensible, because the Conservatives got into a position where they said the numbers are going to come down by blah. For a while, they didn't. They did start coming down. We know we're going to have problems this summer because there's going to be fewer police on the French side of the Channel. There are still more people trying to come into Britain, and so I do expect the first crisis an incoming Labour government to face is a migration crisis.
Yeah, and Deanna, that is a point, right? Rishi Sunak stood in front of a sign that said stop the boats. He's done it several times. The boats have not stopped. We had a record day Wednesday, I think it might have been. And these arbitrary targets for reducing immigration, if you miss those, you get hammered, don't you? And so is Keir Starmer actually doing the right thing there? Or is he masking for the fact that, really, he's not going to do that much to bring it all down?
So I didn't find myself wincing at his answer. I thought it was probably a little bit overly cautious, if anything. But actually, why would you get drawn into a yes-no on something that you know a lot of it might be out of your hands, particularly in that first year? Because let's say Labour want to legislate on this. That takes time. It takes time for the legislation to be put through Parliament, to be implemented, and to actually see some effects from it. So I actually think he was kind of broadly sensible, but I've always hated those kind of mandatory pledges, because I think when a lot of them are so far actually out of your own direct control, why would you leave hostage to fortune?
It's risky, isn't it? It is risky. And also, for anyone who might oppose you as well, they know the target that you have to miss in order for you. So you think he's actually wise? You don't read that as him saying, without saying, I don't actually massively care too much about...
No, I think he's trying to avoid the political bear trap we're talking about. And also, I do think Keir Starmer, one thing I actually quite like about him, I think he's quite genuine about the fact that some of these things actually do take time. I mean, he talks about, like, a decade of national renewal. Like, some things like energy and so on, he says, will take a long time. He did it on that BBC debate last night. He said, this isn't overnight stuff. And I think he genuinely believes that we need to get out of this thing of there's a next short-term political target, next short-term political target. So, look, he still has to have proved he's done something, though. You can't buy yourself time forever, and that's the key point.
I'm just about to say the problem, though, he's going to face is if he does come in with a very large majority, people are going to expect change. And unfortunately, as Deanna said, these things take time in Parliament. It takes time to set up institutions, reform and things. And so he's got to somehow maintain the
support. What is his change going to be? That's a great thing, because that word, change, that's his plinth, actually, isn't it? That's his stop the boats, so it's change. Well, come on, what is that radical change? What is the change?
Well, I think the first thing I would just say is sensible government. I wouldn't say under our last two Prime Ministers, I'm not saying this to try and be political, I wouldn't say Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, or indeed Boris Johnson, were sensible Prime Ministers. We've had chaos, and I'm not repeating the Labour line here, but we have had years of chaos and uncertainty, largest number of government resignations, we don't know when there's going to be an election, the Chancellor says one thing, the Prime Minister says another. If we can have a period of just stability, I think that would be a fresh breath of fresh air for the British people. The second thing is, I think, an acknowledgement of the big issues facing this country. I don't get any sense from Rishi Sunak that he's looking at the long term, what the big challenges facing this country are. Keir has spoken about the need to massively reform public services and things like this, and that's where I think public want to see change.
All right,
I think Rishi Sunak has been quite good on the energy point, actually, on that kind of energy stability point of view. My question, I guess, when it comes to Starmer and this change front, I mean, he talks a really good game. He talks about this sort of decade of national renewal. I've completely forgotten the point I was going to make. It was coming back to you directly to ask you.
When you mention about sensible government and the adults in the room stuff.
That was it. May I?
I thought you might trigger you because I saw you nod when I said that. So go on. Yeah.
I think. Is there a concern, a genuine concern, that if there is this huge supermajority that the polls are predicting at present, that there may be a breadth of the Parliamentary Labour Party that may not have been vetted in the manner in which you would want them to be, maybe more left-wingers than Keir Starmer might have hoped, that might actually lead to some instability within the Labour Party and government.
I think it's always a risk. Whenever you get, in any election, parties were sort of running the whole show and there's barely any opposition, opposition inevitably emerges from within the administration, whether it's in a council or within a parliament. I think the vetting of Labour candidates this time round, particularly following the situation not Bradford, where George Galloway... Rochdale, sorry. He won Bradford before, didn't he? In Rochdale, the vetting of Labour candidates has been exemplary.
Certainly better than reforms this year as well.
Yes, this time round. Yes, quite right. And so I think there will be a lot of loyalty to Keir in the first session of Parliament because he's taken Labour out of the wilderness from our lowest point ever, and that's something to be celebrated, I think.
Would you go private if you're on an NHS waiting list?
If I felt it was the best option for my family, of course I would.
Yeah. Can I just say, that's the obvious answer, isn't it? Like, is that not just obvious? Why is Keir Starmer saying something else?
I think it's an answer of someone who's used to addressing rooms full of Labour members and activists who treat the NHS much more as a religion. I think most ordinary voters just look at that and go, well, if it was my family, they don't think you hate the NHS if you decide it might be better to go private. I've always found it a weird answer. I don't get it. I don't think most voters get it.
I also just think it chips away at the honesty and credibility side of it. I mean, maybe... And then in the same breath he said there with Christopher, he said, I'm not being ideological about it. Well, sorry, I think you are being really deeply ideological about it.
If you're saying, I'm sorry, Mum, but you can't get the operation tomorrow because I don't believe in it. It's fairly ideological to me.
It is. What do you think? You're the Labour man. If you were running to be Labour leader, it's a matter of time. When you're running for Labour leader, how would you address this question?
The NHS would be so brilliant under my liberation that you wouldn't need... No, I would, of course I would. If I had a family member that needed private healthcare because they couldn't get an appointment, I wouldn't think twice about, if I could afford it, doing it for them.
OK, so, and why does he feel like he can't just say that?
The problem is, when you're the Labour leader, as I said, the NHS, in the minds of the Labour Party and many Labour voters, it is almost a religion. They got us through the pandemic, we all went out and clapped. The idea that the Labour leader, the strongest issue in any election Labour pulls out is always the NHS. We will have an NHS week, probably in the last week of this campaign.
Well, we've got 2 weeks to save the NHS, haven't we?
We have 2 weeks. We have 2 weeks to save the NHS. So a Labour leader can't say that.
All right. OK, Adele, what do you make of this NHS religion stuff?
I think for me, throughout the entire election campaign, all the interviews that I've seen Starmer do, either the set pieces or the kind of ad hoc clips, that has been my biggest ick from the entire campaign, because it felt so painfully disingenuous and it felt purely ideological. And I think there's a place for ideology in politics, but when it comes to something like that, where pragmatism is desperately needed, that's what needed to shine through. And I actually really rated Rishi Sunak for simply saying yes.
Yeah, well, because it was honest, wasn't it? And I do think there is a large section of the British people who think if you have got a bit of money, maybe you should go private.
Absolutely.
If we've got 7 million people on NHS waiting list, I don't think they necessarily think that's an elitist thing. I think that actually, arguably, you could say that's maybe a duty.
And it's saving resource for the NHS, surely.
Yeah, well, I would have thought.
Yeah, I just think people just get it. I just think it's one of these things where sometimes all politicians of all parties, they've got an image in their mind of what will annoy voters, and they sometimes have kind of completely misread it, and actually they'll say something, and the voters will just go, yeah, fine, I don't care.
Yeah. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I just want to address an issue that didn't come up there, but Reform are now, just before I came on air anyway, so the latest poll that had them on 20%. There was a couple yesterday that were hovering around. They appear to have now landed at around the 18 or 19% mark in a lot of polls, so I think it's fair to say that's kind of where they are. Is that a big concern for Labour as well, though? I mean, Keir Starmer's not been forced to address this at the moment, but I think there is on the Venn diagram of people who vote Reform, you can see a case for a traditional Labour voter there, Brennan.
You can indeed, and I think what the big surprise of this election, once all the votes are counted, how close and how well Reform do in many currently held Labour seats and the ones we take. I think in many of those seats in the North, Reform are going to be the opposition to Labour, and that means Keir Starmer's going to have to very quickly if he wins, which we expect he will, come up with a line and come up with a narrative and a strategy to hold reform at bay. Because if Farage wins in Clacton, I think Parliament's going to be very different over the next few years, and you could see a situation where if a Labour government were to become unpopular very quickly because of the issues facing the country, reform could be biting at our heels quite quickly.
If you look at the net popularity, individual popularity polls, Rishi's something like 72% of people said they didn't really like him, but about 51% of people said that they didn't like Keir Starmer. So you could see a case where there's a 200-odd seat majority and an immediately relatively unpopular Prime Minister, which it sounds baffling, but that could turn quite quick. Do you see Nigel Farage being, a problem for the Labour Party? I mean, he's obviously a massive problem for the Tories. What was it like, if you don't mind me asking? Because he wasn't standing initially, and then he was. What was the mood like in the Tories when he decided he was going to stand?
Well, we're pre-watershed, so I'm not sure I can be completely honest. No, I mean, my gut reaction was, oh dear, to put it politely for television. And I remember thinking of some of my very close friends who are standing. I'm obviously made the decision I won't be standing again. I have close friends who are standing, who are passionate, who care about this country, who care about their communities, who were incredibly worried about Farage standing because he's a very charismatic figure. He does have a following, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we're seeing it sort of play out in the polls now. The question is how much that sort of takes from the Conservative vote, or whether it was, to some extent, already built in. Because I think where it's a close seat anyway, that may have already be built in. We may have already been past the point of no return in some of these seats. It's going to be interesting. I think it's difficult for any party leader to come into an election campaign so late, have to quickly scrabble together a manifesto, know that most of your candidates are already selected. I'll be interested to know in the final 2 weeks if any of that starts to come a little bit unstuck for Nigel, just because of lack of kind of preparation time. But certainly he's charismatic, but I can't really see reform polling beyond 20% or getting more than probably half a dozen seats.
Do you think people need to wake up to the fact that actually somebody like Nigel Farage, who's got a personality, who has a core base genuinely, and I mean, he was saying over the Tory betting scandal, and the Hindu manifesto as well, which has been doing the rounds today. Apparently, several Conservatives have signed up to the Hindu manifesto, which, amongst other things, promises laxer immigration for people of Hindu origin, etc. He was saying the Tories have just got absolutely no principles anymore. They've got no principles. They don't stand for anything, I think was his exact quote. Whereas, you can dislike what he stands for, but people do know what he stands for, and he's good at articulating that. Is he going to be a major force in British politics after this election, do you think?
Well, he already has been. I think the key issue for reform and the election result that I'm going to be looking out for isn't going to be vote share. It's not actually the number of MPs, which might be 1, it might be 6, I don't know. It's where they finish second. Is it like, if you were the Lib Dems, you always look at this. Where do we finish second this time? Because that's what we're going to try and win next time. And I think at the rate these polls are going, it's going to be quite interesting to see if they have a batch of seats they finish second, that they can go, right, in 4 years' time we're going for those, then I think the number of MPs they have is kind of irrelevant as to how influential they might be in British politics.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point, actually. We'll wait and see exactly where that might be. I've seen some interesting polling data, though, just explaining just that, actually, some remarkable ones where it appears if Reform, while kind of coming second in a huge amount of seats, they could quite legitimately be able to say at the end of it, well, we are maybe the opposition. Just on that, just as we hurtle towards the end of this particular show, but that... I don't know if you had a chance to have a look at this, but there's this Hindu manifesto story that some...
I haven't seen it, so it's...
There's a few Tory MPs who apparently signed themselves up to this. There's a wider point to be had here, though, right? So we've had the muslimvote.co.uk putting out a list of demands. We've now got the Hindu manifesto. There's probably a couple of other examples as well. I just wonder if we are actually seeing now sectarian politics. Really?
I'm not sure it's sectarian or more kind of interest group based, because I remember as a candidate you will get emails from every kind of single issue group you can think of asking you to sign up to their pledges, sign up to their manifesto. So I'm not surprised that there are groups like this that are kind of doing the same thing. There'll be like green manifestos and all kinds of things. So I'm not sure it's anything particularly unusual. And I think the interesting point is whether this has happened in previous elections. I would imagine it has, so I'd imagine it's nothing new.
Yeah, OK. Well, what do you think about this, Brendan? Because it would be quite easy to chip away at this and say what we are seeing now is, kind of pigeonholes of people and a question mark, seriously, about whether or not multiculturalism has worked. If people are all living under the same umbrella of a nation, should we want a manifesto that prioritises Hindus, or is it only natural for people in the Hindu community?
Well, when I stood, like Diana, I stood a few years ago, you get umpteen emails every day from various interest groups and minority groups and campaign sectors as well. But in terms of the question, I do not like segmenting a population into racial, religious, sexual, disability groups. We are one people, we are one country, we're a very diverse country, but we shouldn't end up in a situation where this particular group will only vote for this particular party, because I think that goes down a very nasty sectarian route. And British politics is already dodgy enough as it is. We don't need to add any more into it.
All right, we are... Thank you very much for all sticking around, by the way. I do appreciate it. Thank you very much as well for watching and tuning in. And thank you as well if you're listening on radio or online. This has been GB News Vote 2024 special, The Leaders. The interview with Sir Keir Starmer we played to you a little bit earlier on. It will only be the first of some interviews to come with other party leaders as well. I should make that very, very clear. Up next, a little bit later than Bill, it's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. That's after your weather.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening, welcome to your latest GB News and weather update from the Met Office. This weekend will be a little bit cloudier than the week has been, but it's still going to be warm. But next week will be even warmer. For the time being, though, we've got a few weather fronts still moving in from the west. That's going to introduce quite a lot of cloud from western areas, but also some rain through this evening for parts of Wales, northwestern England, much of Scotland, down to the southwest as well through this evening. And that's going to push eastwards through the night.